Chapter 71, The Jubilee, Part 5, Leviticus 25, 39 to 46. And if thy brother that dwelleth by thee be waxen poor, and be sold unto thee, thou shalt not compel him to serve as a bondservant, but as an hired servant, and as a sojourner he shall be with thee, and shall serve thee unto the year of Jubilee. And then shall he depart from thee, both he and his children with him, and shall return unto his own family, and unto the possession of his fathers shall he return. For they are my servants, which I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as bondsmen. Thou shalt not rule over him with rigour, but shalt fear thy God. Both thy bondsmen and thy bondsmaids, which thou shalt have, shall be of the heathen that are round about you. Of them shall ye buy bondsmen and bondsmaids. Moreover, of the children of the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy, and of their families that are with you, which they begat in your lands, and they shall be your possession. And ye shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you to inherit them for a possession, that they be your bondsmen forever. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, ye shall not rule over one another with rigour. Leviticus 25, 39 to 46. The law requires loans without interest to help the poor. It does not, however, allow the poor to exploit this fact. Bond service to repay debt, or as a refuge from an inability to be provident, was the law. More specific details are to be found in Exodus 21, 1-6, and Deuteronomy 15, 12-18. There is a recognition that some people will prefer a state of dependency. The freedom of all such was possible during the Sabbath years and in the Jubilee. In any case, such people could not be treated as slaves, but simply as lesser members of the household. It is important to note that the law, in Deuteronomy 23, 15 and 16, forbids the return of a runaway bondservant to his master, whether he be an Israelite or a foreigner. This made it necessary for the master to give justice and fair pay and treatment to all bondservants. In verse 38, God declares that He is the Lord, and we must obey because He requires it. It is also noteworthy that if an angry master injured a bondservant, he had to free him at once. Exodus 21, 26 and 27. C.D. Ginsburg noted, "The authorities during the Second Temple enacted that the master's right, even with regards to this kind of bondmen, for life, is restricted to their labour, but that he has no right to barter with them, to misuse them, or to put them to shame." The tasks assigned to a covenant member who was a bondservant cannot be degrading. Verse 39 following makes it clear that they must be comparable to work assigned to competent free labour. God declares that we are all His servants in bondservants all our lives to Him, verse 42, and hence we can never treat another man as our property because we are altogether God's property. As has been noted by one commentator, you may hold him to service, but only to service, nothing more. There was much abuse of this law in Israel. Thus, in 2 Kings 4:1, we see creditors seeking to seize the two sons of a widow and her appeal to Elisha. This was a pagan pattern, as witnessed Nehemiah 5:4 and 5. Israel, Isaiah says, had sold herself into slavery by her sins. Isaiah 51. The Messiah's task is the release of captives and of the exploited. Isaiah 58:7. For failure to obey the law of release, Judah herself would go into captivity. Jeremiah 34, 8-11. Amos 2:6 and 8:4-6 give us a telling account of Israel's apostasy in her disregard for these laws. The same was true in New Testament times, Matthew 18:25. Even if an Israelite chose to be a bondservant, he went free in the Jubilee year. Freedom and responsibility were his inescapable duties. The unbeliever, being a slave to sin by nature, could walk away if conditions were unjust, or convert and become eligible for Sabbath year release. During the early medieval era, Jewish traders took in countless numbers of European slaves in trade for goods. These slaves usually adopted Judaism to gain their freedom, and their descendants make up the major and overwhelming proportion of those who call themselves Jews. In the United States, in the early colonial era, blacks who converted thereby gained freedom. It became necessary to pass legislation against the biblical law, which was common law, to establish slavery in America. Bush summarized the operation of this law in Israel thus: persons were sometimes sold among the Jews by judicial process when they had been guilty of theft and were not able to make satisfaction. Exodus 21:2. Some were sold by their parents, that is, they disposed of their right of service for a stipulated sum and for a number of years. Others, again, when reduced to extreme want, sold themselves, as we have explained more at large. Exodus 21:2. The Jewish writers inform us that this was not considered lawful except in extreme cases. A man might not sell himself to lay up the money which was given for him, nor to buy goods, nor to pay his debts, but merely that he might get bread to eat. Neither was it lawful for him to sell himself as long as he had so much as a garment left. Maimonides. Such practice, while not literally in terms of the law, had a logic to it, namely, as long as the man retained his freedom, he would be able to regain the means to redeem his children from bondservice. Throughout the law, we see regulations governing the treatment of all kinds of servants. God's law requires man to be always mindful that all men are God's creatures and his servants. Samuel Clarke gives us a good summary of these laws. Kidnapping was punished with death. Exodus 11:16. The slave was encouraged to become a proselyte. Exodus 12:44. He might be set free. Exodus 11:26 and 27. Special rules were laid down for the security of his life and limbs. Exodus 11:20, 21, 26. The law would not suffer it to be forgotten that the slave was a man, and protected him in every way that was possible at the time against the injustice or cruelty of his master. Bamberger has called attention to an interesting aspect of this law in later Judaism. It became a requirement that the owner of a non-Jewish slave must seek to convert him and to have him circumcised. If, after a year, the slave refused to become a Jew, he was to be sold. In early Europe, after the fall of Rome, such slaves were commonly sold in the Mediterranean world. Basic to this law is God's statement in verse 42, "They are my servants, which I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as bondsmen." Calvin commented, God here declares that his own rights is invaded when those whom he claims as his property are taken into subjection by another, for he says that he acquired the people as his own when he redeemed them from Egypt. Whence he infers that his right is violated if any should usurp perpetual dominion over a Hebrew. If any objects that this is of equal force when they only serve for a time, I reply that though God might have justly asserted his sole ownership, yet he was satisfied with this symbol of it, and therefore that he suffered by indulgence that they should be enslaved for a fixed period, provided some trace of his deliverance of them should remain. In a word, he simply chose to apply this preventative, lest slavery should altogether extinguish the recollection of his grace, although he allowed it to be thus smothered as it were. Lest, however, cruel masters should trust that their tyranny would be exercised with impunity, Moses reminds them that they had to do with God, who will at length appear as its avenger. Although the political laws of Moses are not now in operation, still the analogy is to be preserved, lest the condition of those who have been redeemed by Christ's blood should be worse amongst us than of the old of his ancient people, to whom Paul's exhortation refers. Ye masters, forbear threatening your slaves, knowing that both your and their master is in heaven. Ephesians 6:9. Calvin was right in seeing the application of this law today, though wrong in seeing the political laws of Moses not now in operation. This is especially curious because he insisted on the present validity of this law. His rendering of Ephesians 6:9 is also questionable. The word in Greek which appears in Ephesians 6:5 and 6 and is referred to in verse 9 is doulos, and it is also the verb from in eye service, verse 6, and as service in verse 7. It can mean slave, but more generally means servant, and implies bondage, that is, in the form of some kind of subjection. Calvin's usage is thus not correct. What is valid in Calvin's statement is that God's property rights are invaded and usurped if we enslave men or in any way exercise ungodly powers over them. This is especially true of fellow believers, but it is also true of all men. The law denies us the freedom to hold a purely individualistic relationship to God. We are members of a community of humanity, and we have an obligation both to God and in Him to our neighbour. Our Lord declares, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Matthew 22:37-40.